Hello and welcome to Bendigo IPTV and our regular look at the federal election and how it's panning out, as well as any other issues around Bendigo. With Keith Sutherland away on leave at the moment, we're joined today by Anthony Radford. Welcome, Anthony, and it's great to have you back on site.
Thanks very much, Dennis. Really good to be here.
Knowing you're no longer editing the weekly, but knowing the Radford I know, and Radford Media's popped up here and there on social media, you'd be one bloke to be taking a hell of an interest in what's happening with the local campaign. We've got Lisa Chester's, we've got Megan Purcell, and of course the Greens. But between the two primary parties, I guess, how do you see things shaking out at the moment?
Yeah, it's fascinating. Those who know me really well know that I hate elections. I just can't stand the fact that all the important things get left aside, and we end up with this silly argument about he said, she said, about who pays for what, where the votes are going.
Almost, yeah.
Yeah, and the really important issues, the long-term issues like education, like health, like homelessness, are never ever touched in an election campaign. So from that instance, I guess, whenever an election's called, I sort of sigh, let alone one for 8 weeks. But look, I think it's at a federal level, I'm really excited by what's being done, and locally as well. I think we've got two really strong candidates who really do have the community at heart, and they're very strong within their own parties and within their own futures. And the fact that they're both women is fantastic for the city.
It's amazing, isn't it, Anthony, to have two female candidates for the federal seat, both so similar in terms of age alone, and to some extent experience. Because I know Lisa, I don't know her background totally, but heavily involved in the party for a long time. And then with Megan, I was surprised to find that she'd had a crack, when she was only 20 or something, 21. Yeah,
Canberra, 2004, I think it was. Yeah, so she's obviously been around for a long time. And I guess if you are a politician, it was the same with Greg Bickley. He's for 10, 15 years been really focused on politics. So it is fantastic to see two women, plus Rosemary from the Greens running as well. So it's great that Bendigo will be represented for a long time to come by a female. And then you look at what's happening at the state level as well. It's really great. And I think it shows how progressive we are as a city as well.
A couple of points here, and I raised one of these with, I think it was Megan Purcell. Bendigo traditionally tended to, for one reason or another, have a sitting member federally, particularly federally, that's not been a member of the government of the day. How big a disadvantage is that?
I don't think it's as big a disadvantage at federal level as it is in state level. We've seen how beneficial it's been to have Jacinta Allen and Marie in the previous years. Yeah. And how tough it was, I guess, for that 4 year in between when the Libs were in. But then whatever it was, the 10 or so years beforehand, where there was a significant Labor Party through Braxton and Brumby. I think with state government, state politics is more parish pump stuff. It really does come down to whether you build something or not, whether your local member's active enough, whether your local member's well contacted. I think at a federal level, all federal politics really is blue sky stuff. So in terms of everything we see in a budget, very little do we actually get affected on the ground in Bendigo. And it's the same in every other electorate. So unless you've got something that you really need funded, like the Calder interchange, which we got last year because we were marginal, at the last election because we were marginal, it really does, there's not really much that matters. So I know some people in Bendigo, some high profile people, some very powerful people really push for that to have, for example, if the Liberal Party are favourites, it'd be great to have a Liberal candidate. But I think at the end of the day, at federal level, it really doesn't matter that much.
The candidates here, Lisa and Megan, are they doing enough to come up with those big projects for this electorate, knowing that we're at 2% or whatever it is, or under? Are they doing enough to generate and get drive around the community and generate interest in coming up with a couple of big projects or visionary things that the electorate could do with?
Well, if we were 2%, perhaps, but I think we're a long way from the 1.26% that we were at the end of the last election. We saw in that last campaign, when it was so close between Greg and Lisa, you saw one party come out with the Calder, Liberals come out with the Calder, and then literally hours later, Labor come out with the Calder. The only thing that didn't really happen on was with the pool. Labor didn't come out with the funding for the pool. So, but unlike state elections, there's lots of promises at state elections and they're delivered through the next 4 years. At the federal level, there's a lot of projects that, a lot of programs that get funded without actual projects, and you have to apply within those programs. So there's still scope, like there was scope with the money that Lisa's promised for the pool, for the tennis centre and for the RSL. Even though if, say, Malcolm Turnbull is returned, that doesn't mean those projects are dead by any means. It just means that there'll be a process to go through, which there was last time as well, through the whole way. So it works a little bit differently. But I think in terms of being connected to the community and connected to what needs to be done in Bendigo, I think they're both on the money, and that's where I think we're really lucky in that we really do have two candidates from both major parties who really are aware of what's going on in town. I think we just really must be grateful for that.
Megan Purcell, to me, would not seem to have the, and she's a very engaging person, very intelligent, and quite enjoyed the open and frank way in which she's presented herself when she's participated in interviews here, without the usual political double speak that you so often get. Just honest and down to earth, I think, and a lot like Lisa Chester's in that regard. I find that refreshing with both of them personally. But doesn't seem to have the profile that Greg had. Greg Bickley, I mean, we've had different people suggesting how much money was thrown at Greg Bickley's campaign. We've had Ian Tulloch sit there where you are only a week ago with Keith Sutherland and suggest that he reckons the margin will be closer to 5% after this election. Do you think we're looking at that much of a blowout because of the lack of money that's being thrown at the Megan Purcell campaign?
I think we're not looking at that because of that, and you have to, what comes first, the chicken or the egg?
That's right.
We had Lisa Chester's, we had two candidates. We didn't have a sitting member last time, and this is the big difference. Lisa's had 3 years to really get to know Bendigo, and when you've lived and breathed it for 3 years, you're always going to be much more polished, going to have a lot more ducks lined up than if you're just a candidate. Last year we had two candidates against each other with Steve retiring, so it really was an opportunity and raise for Greg to jump in.
There was going to be change anyway.
There was going to be change, and I remember Peter Kennedy, who ran an election for Libs a couple of times, saying that the localness and the sitting member gives you 1 or 2, perhaps 3% extra. When you have an electorate sitting on 5%, as it was back then, and two new candidates, that gets wiped out straight away. So that's why Greg spent probably 3 or 4 times more than what Megan has spent, because the opportunity was there, and Greg's backers and the Liberal Party saw that as an opportunity. You also have to take into consideration the federal sphere. Now, back in 2013, it really was all about how much were the Labor Party going to get whacked by. They were in trouble, they were gone, there was no way they were going to win. So the Liberal Party saw an opportunity to get this back from whatever it was, 5-ish, to right back and potentially win. And I tell you, I was at a coffee shop just about half a block from here with a person who went on to be a cabinet minister about 2 weeks later, who sat there and said, Anthony, we're in front here. And this was the Saturday before the election. Their internal polling had them in front, so they thought it was really, really tight. So they were throwing everything from the start because they knew that. This time around, Bill Shorten being a Victorian, you've got potentially Tony Abbott, the whole 2 years of Tony Abbott,
the ghost things,
still flowing through. On top of that, the Liberals identified probably about 6 months ago a number of seats they thought were vulnerable, and Bendigo and McEwen weren't one of them. So for them that far out to suggest that suggests to me that they were never going to throw a lot of money, and nowhere near what.
I'd put to you too, Anthony, that the Nats have come out and selected a candidate, or put forward a candidate that doesn't have the profile that, say, for example, Steve Oliver had. You would have thought that the lack of preferences that would then flow in the way they did from Stephen Oliver towards the Libs, that's got to be a factor here as well. It surprised me they didn't go for somebody that had the profile of a Damien Drum or a Stephen Oliver. Yeah,
and I don't know how organised they are. I mean, back then, Steve Oliver really is the perfect candidate as far as the National Party is concerned, and he almost...
Well, he was Ron Best's successor almost.
Yeah, and the electorate's changed a lot though. From the National Party's perspective, the electorate has changed. I don't think Bridget McKenzie being in town's done anything to help the National Party, not in a negative way. I just think that there hasn't been enough done through her or with her locally, which is fine. She's a senator for the whole state, not just for Bendigo. But I think you've seen the electorate, with this, you have to win Bendigo. You can't focus too much on Maldon and in terms of the over the past, or since Ron Best left, the way Bendigo has changed, the culture that's come into it, the people who have come in, it really isn't ever going to be a National Party seat, I think. I doubt, unless you've got that high-profile candidate, I doubt the Nats are going to get anywhere near enough voting. But there's still enough little minor right-wing parties to help the Libs out a little bit. And look, they'll pick up a little bit here and there.
But not enough,
but
probably.
Not enough, yeah.
I put to Megan Purcell, actually, Anthony, that regardless of whether she won or Lisa won, I felt that it was in the best interest of Bendigo as a federal electorate to have the narrowest possible margin. It's probably a terrible thing to say to a candidate, but at the same time, that is my personal belief that if we went to the next election, regardless of whether the sitting member's Lisa or Megan, the best thing that could happen for Bendigo is that we have a 0.5% margin. In terms of, and look, I hate pork barrelling as much as any other taxpayer, but when you know it's a fact of life, whether you call it pork barrelling or whatever you want to call it, we miss out because we're not on that knife edge for the parties. Would you share that view, or is that being a bit harsh?
No, you're correct. And there's two examples of that. That's the last election campaign in Bendigo when we got a heap of stuff. Perfect example of that at the federal level. Then you look at the opinion, the policies on something like asylum seekers and something like there's a significant amount of people who do not agree with either parties on asylum seekers or on boats. The numbers are quite large, but if you look at where they are and in terms of electorates, they're scattered across the country. So it doesn't work. Unfortunately, our electoral system doesn't work that way. And I think our politics now has jumped the shark, to use a term from Happy Days, is that we have a situation where it's now all about, and it has been for a couple of elections, it's just all about the seats. It's all about what can I say that will influence the people in these marginal seats of Western Sydney, Western Brisbane, and to a lesser extent, some in out of Melbourne. So what you've got is this situation where no matter what the majority of people think across the country, whatever the majority of people think in a handful of electorates, 15, 20, 30 electorates, is what will happen. So unfortunately, that means, once again, this is why I hate election campaigns, because it gets focused on stupid, irrelevant things that, to be fair, Bendigo people don't care about. And this is, I've had this argument numerous times with journalists as well from the national media. You being
an old journo, yeah.
That climate change and asylum seekers doesn't rate in Bendigo. No one cares. It's not an issue. It's not a divisive issue. It's not going to change one person's vote.
People have a view on it, but it's not driving their everyday.
But even their views on it are so different to, and this is not just Bendigo, this is Ballarat as well, a lot of the regional centres, their views are so different on that compared to Western Sydney, compared to suburban Brisbane. And for whatever reason, we had climate change in Bendigo probably second in terms of, first there was Goulburn, then there was Bendigo in terms of water. We lost all our water. Why? Because it didn't rain. So we were one of the early victims of climate change as far as cities are concerned. So we don't doubt it. We don't see it as an issue. We just want it fixed. So that doesn't play anywhere. And Lisa Chesters has actually done, and I'm really looking forward to someone asking Megan Purcell this question, because Lisa Chesters, before she was elected, during the election campaign where Kevin Rudd was Prime Minister in 2013, she came out and she said it to me in a video. She said that she did not support offshore processing, and she still doesn't support offshore processing. She's been one of the, internally and publicly, one of the biggest advocates
backing her.
She has, and she hasn't changed at all. And you know what? Her vote's only going to increase because of it.
I've read just this week that the One Nation, call it what you like, resurrection if you like, with Pauline Hanson. So many people had written her off. It's been such a very long time since she burst onto the federal scene that she's highly likely to have the big comeback and even to potentially have some clout in the Senate. I've had Keith sit there where you are now recently and say that it looked very much like Councillor Elise Chapman as the local One Nation candidate, looked pretty sure to maybe, given the way it was setting up, to end up winning a Senate seat. What's happening there?
In locally or in
locally?
Locally, yeah. Look, I think One Nation always did pretty well in Victoria. If you look back to the early days, there was a famous actor's mum, I think, who did really well in that election, that 98, I think it was, where Pauline Hanson got up and One Nation streamed across the country. Look, Queensland, it's always going to happen in Queensland. You know, Queensland's never going to change, and she's going to do well there. And the numbers, it's a numbers game, and the numbers are pointing at that. Elise Chapman had a bit of recognition outside Bendigo, a little bit of recognition. She only got 2 point something in the state election when she ran for the Country Alliance or whatever it was.
Yeah.
So I don't think she was going to get too many votes here at a federal level. But look, the thing about One Nation is they really are a one-issue party, and when people vote on election day, they rarely vote for one issue unless it's a real ball terror. They rarely vote for it. So I think when it comes down to it, the Australian vote is very smart, and when it comes down to actually ticking that box or putting a one next to the name, they rarely do it on one issue candidates. And but I said Australians. I didn't say Queenslanders. Queenslanders are totally different.
I asked the question, Anthony, because my own feeling is that this election could go either way, and we've gone from when Turnbull burst onto the scene, everyone, including me, thought that, it was just going to be a romp home victory. Shorten was on the nose at the time. You've got to hand it to Bill Shorten. He's hung in there, and he would have to find that in his caucus, that they'd have to be looking at him and thinking we'd all written him off pretty much. The resurgence there has been enormous, and you could argue whether he's bounced up or Turnbull's gone the other way. But it suggests to me that whilst it could go either way, those Senate, the mix of candidates or successful candidates in the Senate, of which One Nation potentially has a role, will be critical to either party. Whether that's the Greens will probably be the main ones, but do you see us ending up with going to a double dissolution, which doesn't happen every 5 minutes, to overcome, to a great extent, a Senate that's not been cooperative and sufficiently cooperative? Are we going to end up with the same thing?
I would doubt it, and I base it on the new laws that have been passed in terms of the way you can vote now in the Senate. I think it's a lot harder for that to happen. I'd be surprised if that happens. I think we'll get to what we had during the sort of late 80s, early 90s, where we had the Greens and the Democrats back then, I suppose, holding the balance of power. So I think the Greens will be the ones who will come out okay, but I think it'll, and there will be the odd one, like there was Brian Harradine, there was the odd random DLP senator back in the day who got up. But I think it's going to be impossible to get so few votes like Ricky Muir, like David Leinholm, and get up on without the ridiculous. But
you probably see the Greens having a bigger role than what they've had even in that Senate balance of power.
I think so, and you'll see that in areas where they poll well through in the lower house. So the electorates where they do really well in the lower house will boost their numbers at a state level in terms of getting a quota. And I wouldn't surprise me that if they do quite well, and if it is that close, I don't think it'll be that close in the Senate, but if it is that close, it'll be the Greens, I reckon, who hold the balance of power.
I love your passion for this and look forward, Anthony, as the campaign drags on. I mean, how many gaffes and upsets have we had? It's on the news every night. Someone else is putting their foot in the mouth. Yeah. So there's a long way to go and a lot to happen. But love your passion for the whole thing, and hopefully we can look forward to some further updates and analysis from you as we draw closer to the finish line, particularly here in Bendigo.
Thanks, Dennis.
No worries. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll look forward to continuing to monitor what's happening in Bendigo with the federal election this year.